At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, a 27-year-old lieutenant from Illinois crouched in the ruins of a bombed-out Japanese bunker staring through a civilian hunting scope at a banyan tree 240 yards away. He was holding a weapon that every officer in his battalion had called a toy, a mail-order deer rifle that had been the punchline of mess hall jokes for 6 solid weeks. In his magazine were 5 rounds of standard military ammunition. Nothing special, nothing fancy. Just the same bullets that machine gunners were chewing through by the thousands without hitting a single target. What happened over the next 3 days would rewrite the rules of infantry warfare. This one man, armed with a weapon the military establishment had laughed at, would hunt down and kill 11 of the deadliest Japanese snipers in the Pacific Theater. 11 shots, 11 kills. He would break a siege that an entire battalion could not break. He would prove that precision beats volume, and he would do it completely alone. His name was John George. He was not a professional soldier. He was a target shooter from Illinois who had won the state championship at 1,000 yards when he was just 23 years old. The youngest winner in state history. Before the war, he spent his weekends punching holes in paper targets at civilian ranges, fine-tuning triggers, and adjusting scopes for competitions that paid nothing but trophies. Now he was sitting in a rotting jungle surrounded by the bodies of 14 Americans who had been shot through the neck and head over the past 72 hours by enemies they never even saw. The battalion was paralyzed. Men were afraid to fill their canteens. Men were afraid to walk patrol. The Japanese had turned the towering banyan trees into sniper nests, and they were picking off Americans with surgical precision, while the U.S. military threw thousands of rounds into the canopy without hitting a single thing. But none of that mattered to John George as he watched that tree through his scope, because in about 30 seconds he was going to prove every single one of his critics dead wrong. The situation on Guadalcanal in late December 1942 was nothing short of catastrophic for the American infantry. The Marines had fought like demons to capture Henderson Field back in August, but they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves or the high ground of Mount Austin. When the 132nd Infantry Regiment arrived to relieve the exhausted Marines, they stepped into a nightmare that no training manual had prepared them for. The terrain was a vertical maze of ridges and rainforest, where tanks could not move and artillery could not see targets. The Japanese had dug in deep. They were not fighting large-scale maneuvers anymore. They had switched to a war of attrition. They had turned the massive banyan trees into fortress towers, climbing 90 feet into the canopy before dawn, tying themselves to branches and sitting there all day in complete invisibility. A Japanese sniper did not need volume of fire. He needed one shot. One bullet through the neck of an American filling his canteen at a stream. One bullet through the head of a patrol leader checking his map. The psychological impact was devastating. In the 72 hours before John George entered that bunker, Japanese snipers had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry. These were not random casualties. These were precision executions that turned brave soldiers into terrified boys who flinched at every shadow. The battalion commander tried everything the military playbook recommended. He ordered more machine gun fire into the trees. He called in mortar strikes on suspected positions. He sent patrol after patrol into the groves to flush out the enemy. Nothing worked. The Americans were firing blind. They were wasting ammunition on shadows while the Japanese laughed from their hidden perches. The commander was watching his unit disintegrate from a combination of malaria and morale failure. His men were dying faster than the jungle diseases could kill them. And then, in a moment of desperation, he remembered the lieutenant with the ridiculous deer rifle. John George had grown up in rural Illinois during the Depression, a time when a boy could earn respect by putting meat on the family table. He learned to shoot before he learned to drive. By the time he was 16, he was outperforming grown men at local rifle competitions. By 23, he was the youngest state champion in Illinois history capable of putting 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. When George enlisted after Pearl Harbor, he brought his personal rifle with him. It was a Winchester Model 70, a bolt-action sporting rifle with a polished walnut stock and a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted on custom mounts that he had paid for with 3 months of his civilian salary. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. It looked like something you would take to the Rocky Mountains to hunt elk on a weekend vacation. It did not look like something you took to the South Pacific to fight the Imperial Japanese Army. The armorer at Camp Forest in Tennessee had looked at the rifle with open contempt. He asked George if the pretty toy was meant for deer or Germans. The other officers were even worse. Captain Morris called it a joke. The platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. They ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon like an officer should. The real weapon they were talking about was the M1 Garand. And on paper, the experts were absolutely correct. The Garand was a semi-automatic marvel that could fire 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. It was rugged reliable and poured out firepower that could suppress an enemy position. By comparison, George's Winchester was a relic from another era. After every single shot, George had to physically lift a steel handle, pull it back to eject the spent casing, push it forward to chamber a new round, and lock it down before he could fire again. The magazine held only 5 rounds. In a firefight at 20 yards, a man with a bolt-action rifle was dead meat against a man with a semi-automatic. The military logic was simple, and it was wrong. Volume of fire wins battles. Spray and pray. Put as much lead in the air as possible and hope something hits. This was the doctrine that had guided infantry tactics since the First World War. Precision was considered a luxury for peacetime competitions and weekend hunters who had never seen combat. But the jungle of Guadalcanal did not care about military doctrine. On the night of January 21st, the battalion commander summoned John George to his tent. He was a desperate man, looking at a desperate situation. His unit was being bled dry by invisible enemies, and every solution approved by the brass had failed completely. He looked at the 27-year-old lieutenant and asked the question that had been the punchline of every joke in the battalion for 6 weeks. Could that mail-order rifle actually hit anything? George did not flinch. He laid out his credentials like he was reading a grocery list. Illinois state champion. 1,000-yard winner. 5 rounds in a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. 6-inch groups at 600 yards using iron sights. He was not bragging. He was stating the physics of what he could do with a precision instrument in his hands. The commander listened carefully. He did not care about trophies or competitions. He cared about stopping the bleeding. He gave George an ultimatum that would change the course of the entire campaign. You have until morning to prove it. George spent that night preparing for what was essentially a suicide mission. He was going to walk out alone without a spotter, without a radio, into the same kill zone where 14 Americans had just died. He sat in his tent and stripped the Winchester down to its components. The rifle had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage, a thick, grease-like preservative that could foul the action if even a trace remained. He cleaned every inch of the mechanism until the bolt cycled like silk. He checked the scope mounts, obsessively tightening the screws until they were rock solid. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered only 2.5 power magnification. By modern standards, that is practically nothing. But compared to the iron sights on a Garand, it was a telescope. It was enough to see the twitch of a finger at 200 yards. It was enough to spot the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel against the chaos of vines and branches. He loaded 5 rounds of standard military ball ammunition. Nothing special. The same cartridges that machine gunners were wasting by the belt. He packed 60 more rounds in stripper clips and tucked them into his webbing. The rifle weighed 9 pounds empty, and the scope added another 12 ounces. It was a heavy beast to carry through the mud. But George did not mind the weight. Weight meant stability. Weight meant that when the firing pin struck the primer and the rifle bucked against his shoulder, the barrel would not jump off target. Weight was his friend in a fight where he would only get one chance. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves. Intelligence said the snipers were in the banyan trees to the west. George settled into position, resting the forestock of the Winchester on a piece of broken concrete. He did not scan quickly like a nervous amateur. He moved the scope with agonizing slowness, grid by grid, dissecting the wall of green in front of him. He was not looking for a man. He was looking for something that did not belong. A straight line in a world of curves. A color that was slightly off. A shadow that was too dark. He filtered out the screaming birds and the buzzing insects and the distant thump of artillery. He became a predator in a world of prey. He sat there for over 2 hours, sweat dripping into his eyes, muscles cramping, watching for a ghost to make a single mistake. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved. There was no wind. The air was dead still. But 87 feet up in a massive banyan tree, 240 yards away, a single branch dipped and swayed. George froze. He watched the spot with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the perfect moment to pull a trigger. The branch moved again, and then the shadows resolved into a shape. It was a man in dark clothing, wedged into a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the supply trail where George's battalion had been moving ammunition crates. He was waiting for a helmet to appear. He was waiting to put another bullet into another American neck. He had no idea that 240 yards to his flank, the toy rifle was pointed straight at his chest. George reached up and clicked the scope adjustment. 2 clicks right for the negligible crosswind. He settled his cheek against the stock and felt the familiar cold wood against his skin. He breathed in slowly, let half of it out, and paused at the natural respiratory pause that competition shooters spend years perfecting. The trigger on the Winchester broke at exactly 3.5 pounds. It was glass smooth. He had spent countless hours tuning it at Camp Perry before the war, never imagining that the work would one day save American lives on a jungle island in the Pacific. The crosshairs were steady on the dark shape in the tree. The mocking was over. The jokes were over. The debate between bolt action and semi-automatic was completely irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was whether a civilian target shooter could kill a professional killer before the professional killer saw him. George tightened his finger. The trigger broke. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder with that sharp, solid punch he had felt 10,000 times before. But this time, the report did not echo off a competition berm. It cracked through the humid jungle air like a thunderclap. 240 yards away, the dark shape in the banyan tree jerked violently. The Japanese sniper tumbled backward out of his perch. His rifle spun away from him as gravity took over. He fell 90 feet to the jungle floor and hit the ground with a sound that George could not hear but could feel in his bones. 1 shot. 1 kill. The toy had just drawn first blood. But John George did not celebrate. He did not relax. He worked the bolt of the Model 70 with mechanical precision, ejecting the hot brass and chambering a fresh round. He kept his eye glued to the scope because he knew something that none of the other officers understood. Japanese snipers do not work alone. They work in pairs. If there was a shooter in that tree, there was a spotter nearby. And that spotter was now very, very angry. The real hunt had just begun. In the next 48 hours, John George would face counter-snipers' mortar barrages and a hunter-killer team specifically deployed to destroy him. He would be driven from position to position, hunted by the best marksmen the Japanese Empire could field. And he would kill every single one of them. But that is a story for Part 2. In Part 1, we watched John George prove every critic wrong with a single bullet. A 27-year-old target shooter from Illinois walked into a jungle kill zone armed with nothing but a civilian deer rifle that his commanding officers had called a toy. He found a Japanese sniper hiding 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. 1 shot, 1 kill. The mail-order sweetheart had drawn first blood. But killing 1 sniper was not victory. It was a declaration of war. Intelligence said there were 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. George had eliminated 1. 10 remained, and those 10 had just watched their comrade fall from his perch. They knew the Americans suddenly had a capability they did not have yesterday. They knew someone was hunting them back. The easy part was over. The real game was about to begin. Because Japanese snipers do not panic. They do not run. They adapt. And in the next 48 hours, John George would face counterattacks, mortar barrages, and a hunter-killer team specifically deployed to put a bullet in his skull. The jungle fell silent after that first kill. George kept his eye glued to the scope, scanning the surrounding trees with the patience of a man who understood exactly what was coming. He knew the Japanese operated in pairs, shooter and spotter. If there was one man in that banyan, there was another man nearby watching the same kill zone. That second man had just seen his partner tumble 90 feet to his death. He was not going to expose himself easily. George began methodically dissecting the canopy, moving the crosshairs inch by inch through the chaos of vines and shadows. The 2.5-power magnification of the Lyman scope forced him to work slowly. Every dark shape looked like a threat. Every patch of moss looked like a helmet. He had to trust his eyes to find the anomaly, the one thing that did not belong in a world of organic chaos. 26 minutes passed. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Biting ants crawled up his legs. He ignored everything except the wall of green in front of him. At 9:43 he found him, 60 yards north of the first tree in a different banyan entirely. A shape was moving. This soldier was lower, maybe 50 feet up. He was climbing down the trunk, trying to retreat. He had heard the shot, seen his partner fall, and realized their position was burned. It was a fatal mistake. Movement is the sniper's death sentence. In a world of stillness, motion screams like a siren. George tracked him through the scope. He led the target, slightly compensating for the downward movement. He breathed, he squeezed, he fired. The second sniper fell backward through the canopy, crashing through branches and hitting the jungle floor within seconds of his partner. 2 shots. 2 kills. George reloaded the Winchester from a stripper clip, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The toy rifle was working. By noon, the body count had risen to 5. Word spread through the battalion like an electric current. The men who had spent 6 weeks making jokes about the mail-order sweetheart stopped laughing. Officers started appearing at the bunker, asking if they could watch George work. He told them to get lost. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. He was not running a show. He was fighting a war. After the 5th kill, something changed. The Japanese stopped moving during daylight hours. The trees went still. George spent the entire afternoon staring at empty branches, watching shadows that never resolved into targets. He realized immediately what had happened. The surviving snipers had adapted. They were no longer hunting Americans. They were hunting him. The next morning brought rain. A heavy tropical storm turned the world into a gray smear of water and mud, cutting visibility to less than 100 yards. George sat in the bunker, shivering, protecting his optics from the moisture that could fog the lenses and render his scope useless. When the storm finally broke at 8:15, he was ready. So were they. At 9:12, he spotted the 6th sniper. This one was smarter than the others. He had used the noise of the rain to climb into a tree 290 yards out, further than any of the previous targets. He was testing George's range, trying to find the outer limit of the Americans' capability. George adjusted his holdover for the increased distance, trusted the ballistics of the 30-06 cartridge, and dropped him with a single round through the chest. But the 6th kill triggered a response that George had not anticipated. The Japanese had realized they could not win this sniper duel on equal terms. Their marksmen were dying one by one against an opponent they could not see and could not match. So they decided to cheat. At 9:57, a whistling sound cut through the humid air. George recognized it instantly. Mortar. He threw himself flat against the concrete as the first shell exploded 40 yards short of his position. Dirt and debris showered down on his helmet. A second shell hit 20 yards closer. They were walking the fire toward him, adjusting each shot based on the sound and muzzle flash of his rifle. The third salvo landed directly on the roof of the bunker he had been using for 2 days. The explosion shattered concrete and splintered the wooden beams. If George had hesitated for even 5 seconds, he would have been obliterated. He grabbed the Winchester and sprinted out the back, diving into a muddy shell crater as more rounds impacted behind him. The bunker that had been his home for 48 hours was now a smoking pile of rubble. The Japanese had made their intentions clear. They were no longer trying to outshoot him. They were trying to delete his grid square from the map entirely. George relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north. He was wet, muddy, and shaking from the near miss. But he was still hunting. And so were they. At 2:23 that afternoon, he killed his 7th sniper. An hour later, he killed the 8th, a man who had gotten careless with his concealment and silhouetted himself against the afternoon sky. By 5:00 p.m., George had fired 12 rounds and killed 8 men. Captain Morris called him back to the perimeter. The captain, who had once called the Winchester a joke, now looked at George with something approaching awe. He wanted the lieutenant back in the field at dawn, but George knew the math was changing. He had killed 8 snipers out of 11. The 3 who remained were the survivors, the best of the best. They had watched their comrades die for 2 days. They knew what George looked like. They knew the sound of his rifle. They knew his tactics. And they were waiting. January 24th dawned with more rain. George moved to a completely new position, a cluster of large rocks, 70 yards south of his previous location. He could never use the same spot twice. The Japanese had already proven they could triangulate his position from sound alone. He settled into the rocks and waited for the drizzle to fade. At 8:17, he spotted what appeared to be the 9th sniper. The man was in a palm tree, 190 yards out. But something was wrong. The position was too obvious. The concealment was poor. From George's elevated vantage point, he could see the man's shoulders clearly through the fronds. George began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. His instincts were screaming at him. This was too easy. This was not how a survivor behaved. A man who had lived through 2 days of slaughter would not expose himself like an amateur. This was bait. George lowered his rifle and began scanning the trees around the decoy. If this was a trap, there was a real shooter somewhere nearby waiting for George to reveal his muzzle flash so he could put a bullet through the American's skull. It took 11 agonizing minutes of careful scanning before George found him. 80 yards northwest of the palm tree, buried deep in a banyan 91 feet up, was the real sniper. He was perfectly concealed, his rifle trained not on the American supply lines, but on George's previous position at the fallen tree. The Japanese soldier was waiting for George to shoot the bait so he could kill the hunter. George faced a tactical puzzle that would have paralyzed most men. If he shot the real sniper, the sound would reveal his new position in the rocks. If he did nothing, the sniper might eventually spot him. He decided to use their own trap against them. He swung the Winchester back to the decoy in the palm tree and fired. The bait sniper fell. George immediately ripped the bolt back, chambered a fresh round, and swung toward the banyan. The real sniper, hearing the shot, jerked his head toward the sound. That momentary movement was all George needed. He put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the Japanese soldier could traverse his weapon. The 10th sniper fell. 2 shots in under 4 seconds. George grabbed his ammunition and ran, throwing himself into a drainage ditch 40 yards away, just as Japanese machine gun fire tore apart the rocks he had been sitting on. Stone fragments sprayed into the air like shrapnel. They were throwing everything at him now. Mortars, machine guns, decoys, coordinated ambushes. He was one man with a bolt-action rifle fighting an entire defensive network. And he was winning. The 11th sniper was the ghost, the master. George scanned the trees for over an hour without seeing anything. The canopy was silent. The jungle had become a graveyard of his own making, and somewhere in that graveyard, one final predator was waiting. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. He had been looking up. The 11th sniper was not in the trees at all. He was on the ground. George caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision 60 yards to the south. A shape was moving through the ferns low and fast. The Japanese had abandoned the vertical war. The last survivor was crawling through the undergrowth like a tiger hunting through high grass, using the vegetation for concealment as he moved toward the rocks where George had been an hour before. He was hunting George the same way George had been hunting his comrades. George watched him through the scope. The sniper reached the rocks and set up a firing position aiming toward the drainage ditch. His back was to George, 38 yards away, an easy shot. But George hesitated again. This was the 11th man, the best of them all. Would he really expose his back so carelessly? It felt wrong. It felt like another trap. George widened his focus, scanning the area behind the rocks. And there it was. 70 yards to the northwest, behind a fallen tree trunk, a second soldier was lying motionless, with his rifle aimed at the same drainage ditch. 2 men working as a hunter-killer team on the ground. The man in the rocks was the flush. The man behind the tree was the hammer. If George shot the man in the rocks, the man behind the tree would see the flash and kill him while he was cycling the bolt. The Winchester was too slow for a 2-target engagement at this distance. He could not shoot them both before one of them returned fire. George slowly lowered his body into the water-filled crater he had found earlier. He sank down until the muddy water was lapping at his chin. He held the Winchester vertically, keeping the barrel dry, and became part of the swamp. He waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He signaled to his partner. They had not seen George. They assumed he had fled further east. Both men began moving, walking parallel to each other, sweeping the area. They walked right past George's crater, their backs now completely exposed. George rose from the water like a creature from a nightmare. Mud streamed off his face and uniform. He shouldered the Winchester and aimed at the closer soldier 42 yards away. He fired. The man dropped. George worked the bolt with desperate speed and swung the muzzle to the second man. The second soldier was turning his rifle, rising, his eyes locking onto George. It was a race between a bolt-action mechanism and a human reaction time. George fired first. The second soldier collapsed. 11 shots, 11 snipers. Dead. But as the echo of the last shot faded across the jungle, George heard something that turned his blood to ice. Voices. Lots of them. Coming from the tree line less than 50 yards away. The snipers had not been alone. An infantry patrol was coming to check the bodies. George was standing in a crater with a bolt-action rifle, 3 rounds in the magazine, and an entire squad of angry Japanese soldiers bearing down on his position. The hunt was not over. It had just transformed into a brawl for survival. George dropped back into the crater and held perfectly still as the Japanese soldiers discovered the bodies of their snipers. He listened to their shouts of anger and confusion. He counted at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. They were searching the area, following the boot prints that George had left in the soft mud. The first soldier appeared at the rim of the crater, looking straight down. Their eyes met across 10 feet of distance. The soldier opened his mouth to shout a warning. George did not wait. He raised the Winchester out of the water and fired from the hip. The bullet hit the soldier in the chest at point-blank range and threw him backward. George worked the bolt, stood up in a spray of water, and shot 2 more soldiers who appeared at the rim. 3 shots in 4 seconds. 3 kills. Then he ran. He exploded from the crater and sprinted into the jungle as bullets snapped past his head and thudded into the trees around him. He ran for 90 seconds through terrain that would have been difficult to walk, vines grabbing his ankles, thorns tearing his face. He threw himself into another shell crater and lay there gasping, clutching the Winchester to his chest. 1 round left in the chamber. The Japanese had not pursued. They were checking their dead, likely stunned that a single American had killed 5 of their men in less than 2 minutes. George began the slow crawl back toward American lines. It took him 25 minutes to cover the distance, moving like a ghost through the undergrowth he had learned to read like a book. At 11:13, he saw the familiar shape of concertina wire. A Marine sentry challenged him from a foxhole. George identified himself and stumbled through the perimeter. He walked straight to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. George gave his report in a flat, exhausted voice. 11 snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers with 11 hits and 1 miss. Then the firefight with the infantry. 3 more confirmed kills. 5 rounds total in that engagement. 14 enemy soldiers dead. Morris asked about ammunition status. George tapped his pocket. 1 round left. The captain looked at the battered Winchester, unrecognizable under layers of mud and jungle filth. He did not call it a toy anymore. He called it a weapon. And he wanted George to teach other men how to use it. That night, Colonel Ferry summoned George to regimental headquarters. The colonel had 14 Springfield rifles equipped with unertl scopes, actual military sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. He had 40 men who were qualified expert marksmen. He wanted George to build a sniper section. George accepted the mission on one condition. He pointed to the mud-caked Winchester slung over his shoulder. The colonel smiled and approved the request. The toy had earned its place. But building a sniper school in the middle of a combat zone was only the beginning. George now had to transform paper-qualified marksmen into jungle hunters who could match what he had done alone. He had to convince officers who had spent their careers believing in volume of fire that precision was the future of infantry warfare. And somewhere in the Japanese high command reports were being filed about an American sniper who had single-handedly destroyed an entire defensive network. They would not make the same mistake twice. In Part 3, we will see how John George turned 40 amateur marksmen into the deadliest unit on Guadalcanal. We will watch the sniper school claim 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly losses. And we will witness the moment when Japanese high command realized they had created a monster they could not stop. The hunt had ended. The war was just beginning. In Part 1, John George walked into a jungle kill zone with a rifle his commanders called a toy. He killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days with 12 rounds. In Part 2, he survived mortar barrages, counter-sniper ambushes, and a hunter-killer team deployed specifically to destroy him. He emerged from the jungle with 1 bullet left in his chamber and 14 confirmed kills to his name. Now Colonel Ferry had given him a new mission. Build a sniper school. Take 40 expert marksmen and transform them into jungle hunters who could replicate what George had done alone. The Winchester Model 70 had proven that precision beats volume. But one man with a deer rifle could not win a war. George needed to multiply himself. The Japanese High Command had already noticed that something had changed. Their sniper network at Point Cruz had gone silent. 11 of their best marksmen had simply vanished. Reports were filtering back through the chain of command. An American with an unusual rifle was hunting their hunters, and the Imperial Army was about to respond with everything they had. The sniper school that John George established was not a classroom. It was a mud pit 2 miles east of Henderson Field, where the air was thick with humidity and the constant thunder of artillery. 40 men reported for duty on January 26, 1943. Every single one of them held an official designation as an expert marksman according to Marine Corps standards. They could hit bullseyes at 500 yards on a manicured rifle range with bench rests and perfect lighting. George looked at their qualifications and threw them in the trash. He gathered the men in a clearing and delivered a speech that stripped away every illusion they had about what they were going to learn. He told them that hitting paper targets meant nothing in the jungle. Paper does not shoot back. Paper does not hide in trees. Paper does not set traps using decoys while a second shooter waits to put a bullet through your skull. He told them that 8 of them would wash out in the first 3 days. He was wrong. 12 washed out. The training was brutal and deliberate. George taught them to brace their heavy Springfield rifles against rotting logs' termite mounds and the shoulders of their spotters. He taught them to read wind through the movement of leaves at different heights in the canopy. He taught them the deadly geometry of shooting upward at steep angles where the bullet drops differently than on flat ground. Most importantly, he taught them patience. He made them lie motionless in the mud for 6 hours at a stretch, watching a single sector of jungle, waiting for a target that might never appear. He made them identify the difference between natural movement and human movement at distances beyond 200 yards. He made them understand that in sniper warfare, the man who moves first dies first. By January 30th, the surviving 28 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards while hiding in undergrowth that would have concealed them from observers standing 10 feet away. George organized them into 14 two-man teams: shooter and spotter, hunter and killer, the same configuration the Japanese had used against him. But the Japanese were not sitting idle while George built his school. Intelligence reports began filtering in from the front lines. The enemy had changed their tactics completely. The surviving snipers in other sectors had abandoned the tall banyan trees. They were now operating from ground level using spider holes and camouflaged pits instead of elevated positions. They had learned from the slaughter at Point Cruz that height was no longer an advantage against an opponent who knew how to look up. More concerning were the reports of Japanese patrols actively hunting for the American sniper school. They knew George was training men somewhere near Henderson Field. They knew that if they could destroy the school before it became operational, they could prevent the Americans from developing a permanent counter-sniper capability. On January 31st, a Japanese reconnaissance team was spotted less than a mile from the training area. They were photographing the terrain and taking notes. The enemy was planning something. George accelerated the training schedule. He had planned for 2 weeks of instruction. He now had 5 days. The pressure from above was equally intense. Colonel Ferry wanted results immediately. The 132nd Infantry was preparing for a major offensive to clear Mount Austin, and the Japanese had reinforced their sniper positions on the high ground. Every day of delay meant more American casualties. Ferry gave George an ultimatum. The sniper section would deploy on February 1st, ready or not. George pushed back. He told the colonel that sending half-trained men into a sniper duel was not combat. It was murder. The Japanese had been doing this for years. His students had been doing it for days. They needed more time. Ferry was not interested in excuses. He reminded George that the men dying on the supply trails did not have more time. The sniper section would deploy in 48 hours. George spent those 48 hours conducting what he called the final examination. It was not a written test. He took 4 two-man teams into the sector west of the Matanikau River to hunt Japanese stragglers. Real targets. Real consequences. If his students could not perform under actual combat conditions, he would know immediately. He paired himself with a corporal named Hayes and set up on a high ridge overlooking a supply trail the Japanese were known to use. The other teams spread out across a 2-mile front, each covering a different approach vector. At 7:20 on the morning of February 1st, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail below George's position. He was a scout moving carefully, checking the terrain ahead of a larger group. Hayes spotted him first and called the range, 215 yards. George settled the crosshairs on the man's chest and fired. The scout dropped without a sound. Over the next 6 hours, George's team killed 6 Japanese soldiers with 7 shots. 1 miss at extreme range. 6 hits. Across the sector, the other teams reported similar results. By the time the sun went down, the sniper section had killed 23 enemy soldiers. American casualties were 0. The final examination was over. The school had graduated. But the graduation ceremony was interrupted by news that sent a chill through the entire battalion. Japanese forces had launched a major counteroffensive along the Matanikau River. They were attempting to push the Americans back from the ground they had gained over the past month. Intelligence estimated at least 2,000 enemy soldiers were involved in the assault, and leading the assault were fresh sniper teams brought in specifically to neutralize George's newly trained hunters. The Battle of the Matanakaw River on February 2, 1943, was not a single engagement. It was a rolling series of firefights across a front that stretched for nearly 3 miles. Japanese infantry probed American positions throughout the day, looking for weak points. And hidden among those infantry units were sniper teams tasked with one mission: find and destroy the American counter-snipers before they could establish dominance. George deployed his 14 teams across the most vulnerable sectors. He kept the Winchester Model 70 for himself and positioned his team on a ridge overlooking the main river crossing. If the Japanese were going to push through in force, they would have to cross at this point. And George intended to make that crossing very expensive. The first contact came at 6:47 in the morning. A Japanese patrol emerged from the tree line on the far side of the river approximately 300 yards from George's position. There were 12 men visible. George scanned the group through his scope, looking for the one target that mattered most. He found him near the back of the formation. An officer carrying a sword and binoculars directing the movement of his troops. George adjusted for the slight crosswind. He settled his breathing. He fired. The officer fell. The patrol scattered into the undergrowth, but before they could find cover, 2 more shots rang out from American positions further down the ridge. 2 more Japanese soldiers dropped. George's students were performing exactly as trained. Target the leadership first. Create confusion. Let the enemy panic. Over the next 4 hours, the Japanese made 7 attempts to cross the Matanakaw at various points. Each attempt was met with precision rifle fire that killed officers, radio operators, and machine gun crews before the main body could advance. The American snipers were not trying to stop the entire assault. They were surgically removing the command and control elements that made coordinated movement possible. By 11:00 a.m., the Japanese advance had stalled completely. Their infantry was pinned down on the wrong side of the river, unable to move forward, because every man who showed leadership initiative was immediately killed. The American machine gunners and riflemen had barely fired a shot. The sniper teams had done the work for them. At 11:23, the Japanese brought up their own snipers to counter the American threat. George watched through his scope as 3 men in camouflaged uniforms crept into position on a small hill overlooking the river. They were good. They moved slowly and used the terrain effectively. But they made one critical error. They positioned themselves together instead of spreading out. George did not fire immediately. He waited for them to settle into their shooting positions. He waited for them to become focused on finding American targets. And then, when all 3 were stationary and committed, he fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first shot hit the sniper on the left. The second shot hit the sniper in the center. The third shot missed, as the sniper on the right threw himself behind cover. But before the survivor could relocate, Corporal Hayes spotted movement and called out the new position. George shifted his aim and fired again. The third sniper stopped moving. 3 enemy snipers killed in under 30 seconds. The Japanese counter-sniper effort on this sector was finished. By 2:00 p.m., the Japanese assault had completely collapsed. Their commanders were dead. Their communications were disrupted. Their sniper support had been eliminated. The surviving infantry began withdrawing back across the river, leaving behind over 60 bodies and a significant quantity of abandoned equipment. George's sniper section had fired fewer than 100 rounds total. They had killed 31 confirmed enemy soldiers, including 4 officers and 7 snipers. They had suffered 0 casualties. The kill ratio was not just favorable, it was unprecedented. News of the victory at the Matanakaw spread through the American positions like wildfire. The battalion that had been paralyzed by invisible Japanese snipers just 2 weeks earlier had now turned the tables completely. Men who had been afraid to fill their canteens were now volunteering for patrol duty because they knew the sniper teams were watching over them. The psychological impact on the Japanese was equally dramatic. Prisoners captured in the following days reported that their units had been warned about American marksmen operating with unusual rifles. They had been told that these marksmen could kill from distances beyond 500 yards, and that they specifically targeted officers and communications personnel. The prisoners said morale had dropped significantly since the Matanakaw defeat. Over the next 10 days, George's sniper section continued to expand its operations. They deployed across the entire regimental front, providing overwatch for patrols protecting supply convoys, and systematically eliminating Japanese positions that had resisted conventional assault. The statistics were staggering. In 12 days of operation, the 14 two-man teams achieved 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly casualties. They had effectively neutralized Japanese sniper activity across the entire 132nd Infantry sector. Supply convoys that had previously required platoon-strength escorts could now move with minimal protection. Casualty rates from sniper fire dropped by 90%. Colonel Ferry submitted George for a Bronze Star. The recommendation cited his individual marksmanship as well as his development of the sniper training program that had transformed the tactical situation on Guadalcanal. The military bureaucracy that had laughed at his civilian rifle was now praising his innovation, but the recognition came with a cost. On February 7, 1943, George was operating near the Tanaru River when his luck finally ran out. A Japanese rifleman hidden in the brush put a bullet through his left shoulder. The round missed the bone but tore through muscle and tissue. Corporal Hayes dragged him to cover and called for a medic. George was evacuated to a field hospital. His Guadalcanal campaign was over. The Winchester Model 70 went with him, still caked in mud and jungle filth. He had fired that rifle in combat for 16 days. He had personally killed 17 enemy soldiers. He had trained 28 men who had killed 74 more. Behind him, he left a legacy that would reshape American infantry doctrine for generations. The sniper section he created continued operating after his evacuation, eventually achieving over 100 confirmed kills before the Guadalcanal campaign ended. The tactics he developed were studied, documented, and distributed to other units across the Pacific Theater. The toy rifle had proven something that the military establishment had refused to believe. In jungle warfare, precision was not a luxury. It was the difference between victory and slaughter. But what happened to John George after he left that hospital bed? What became of the Illinois target shooter who had single-handedly broken a siege and built a school of death in the middle of a combat zone? The answer involves a classified mission in Burma, a unit called Merrill's Marauders, and 3 more kills at distances that would make his Guadalcanal shots look like child's play. In Part 4, we will follow George into the mountains of Southeast Asia. We will watch him modify the Winchester for long-range jungle warfare. And we will discover what happened to the man and the rifle after the war ended, a story that almost nobody knows. The hunt was over, but the legend was just beginning. In Part 1, a 27-year-old target shooter from Illinois walked into a jungle kill zone with a rifle his commanders called a toy. In Part 2, he survived mortar barrages and hunter-killer teams deployed specifically to destroy him. In Part 3, he built a sniper school that achieved 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly losses, transforming American infantry tactics on Guadalcanal forever. But on February 7, 1943, a Japanese bullet tore through John George's shoulder and ended his campaign in the Pacific. He was evacuated to a field hospital, the Winchester Model 70, still clutched in his hands, caked with mud and the residue of 16 days of continuous combat. The man who had proven every critic wrong was now lying on a stretcher watching the jungle he had conquered disappear behind the canvas flaps of a medical transport. What happened next? What became of the Illinois marksman who had single-handedly broken a siege and created a school of death? The answer involves a classified mission that almost nobody knows about, a unit that would become legendary, and a final chapter that reveals the true measure of the man behind the rifle. Because John George did not go home. He went somewhere far more dangerous. When George recovered from his shoulder wound in March 1943, The military offered him exactly what most soldiers in his position would have wanted: a training assignment stateside, a desk job away from the killing, a chance to survive the war and return to civilian life with honors and medals. George refused all of it. He volunteered for a classified deep penetration mission in Burma with a unit that would later become known as Merrill's Marauders. This was not a step sideways. This was a step into the most brutal theater of the entire war. The Marauders were tasked with marching hundreds of miles through mountains and jungles that the Japanese considered completely impassable, cutting supply lines and destroying enemy positions far behind the front. George realized immediately that the Winchester Model 70, as perfect as it had been on Guadalcanal, needed to evolve for this new mission. The heavy walnut stock and the steel Lyman scope were too burdensome for a man carrying 60 pounds of gear over Himalayan ridges. Weight that had been an advantage in a static sniper position became a liability on a 3-month death march. So he modified the rifle again. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver 330 model. He swapped the beautiful walnut stock for a lighter synthetic version. He shaved ounces everywhere he could, transforming his hunting rifle into a specialized instrument of long-range jungle warfare. In Burma, the engagements were fewer, but the stakes were infinitely higher. George used the rifle only 3 times during the entire campaign. But those 3 shots became the stuff of legend among the men who witnessed them. The first was at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. The second was at 380 yards against a machine gun position that had pinned down an entire company. The third was at 290 yards to silence a sniper who was systematically killing marauders as they tried to advance through a mountain pass. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired a second round at any target. He knew that the unique crack of the Winchester was a dinner bell for every Japanese mortar team in the valley. He shot and he moved, disappearing into the terrain before the enemy could triangulate his position. George survived the Burma campaign. He was discharged in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel with 2 Bronze Stars and a reputation that had spread far beyond his original unit. The military establishment that had laughed at his deer rifle now studied his methods and incorporated them into official doctrine. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. John George did not become a professional soldier. He did not spend his post-war years consulting for weapons manufacturers or training special forces units. He took a sharp left turn into academia, using the GI Bill. George attended Princeton University and then Oxford, eventually becoming an expert on African affairs and a diplomat. The man who had hunted human beings in the canopy of Guadalcanal spent the rest of his career wearing suits and discussing policy in Washington conference rooms. He served in various diplomatic positions throughout Africa during the Cold War, applying the same analytical precision that had made him deadly in combat to the complex world of international relations. But he never forgot the rifle, and he never forgot the lessons he had learned in the jungle about the difference between institutional wisdom and practical reality. In 1947, George sat down and wrote a book that would influence military thinking for generations. He called it Shots Fired in Anger. It was not a memoir filled with heroic bravado or emotional war stories. It was a cold, technical, and brutally precise analysis of ballistics, jungle tactics, and the equipment failures that got American soldiers killed. He documented exactly why the military establishment had been wrong about precision rifles. He explained the physics of long-range shooting in humid jungle environments. He provided detailed accounts of Japanese sniper tactics and how to counter them. The book became an underground Bible for military historians and firearms enthusiasts. It was required reading at the Army Marksmanship Unit and influenced the development of sniper programs throughout the Cold War era. Generations of military snipers learned their craft from principles that George had first tested in the mud of Point Cruz. But the real legacy was not the book. It was the doctrine. Before John George proved otherwise, the United States military believed that precision rifle fire was obsolete. Volume of fire wins battles. Spray and pray. Put as much lead in the air as possible, and let statistics do the killing. This was the thinking that had dominated infantry tactics since the First World War. George's 16 days on Guadalcanal shattered that assumption completely. He demonstrated that one man with a precision rifle could accomplish what an entire platoon with automatic weapons could not. He proved that in jungle warfare, where visibility was measured in feet and targets appeared for only seconds, the ability to hit with the first shot was worth more than the ability to fire 10 shots quickly. The sniper programs that George's success inspired went on to save thousands of American lives in Korea and Vietnam. The fundamental principles he established: the two-man teams, the emphasis on patience and observation, the targeting of enemy leadership and communications became standard doctrine that remains in use today. Every modern military sniper who sets up on a rooftop in a combat zone is using techniques that trace directly back to a muddy bunker on Guadalcanal in January 1943. The numbers tell the story better than any words. During World War II, the average number of rounds expended per enemy casualty was approximately 25,000. In Vietnam, where sniper teams operated using George's principles, that number dropped to 1.3 rounds per confirmed kill for trained snipers. The efficiency improvement was not incremental. It was revolutionary. The Winchester Model 70 itself became the template for military precision rifles. Its controlled feed action and trigger design influenced every bolt-action sniper rifle developed over the following decades. The Marine Corps adopted a militarized version as their primary sniper weapon for years. The rifle that had been dismissed as a civilian toy became the gold standard against which all other precision rifles were measured. But the biggest lesson from John George's story is not about rifles or ballistics. It is about innovation and the institutions that resist it. Why did the military establishment reject George's approach so thoroughly at first? The officers who called his Winchester a toy were not stupid men. They were experienced professionals who had studied warfare and understood the capabilities of their equipment. They rejected precision shooting, not because they were incompetent, but because they were institutionalized. Large organizations develop standard practices that work well enough most of the time. These practices become doctrine. Doctrine becomes tradition, and tradition becomes religion. Anyone who challenges the established way of doing things is seen not as an innovator, but as a threat. George's Winchester was not just a different weapon. It was a challenge to everything the infantry establishment believed about how wars should be fought. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The machine gun was dismissed by cavalry officers who could not imagine a world without horses. The tank was rejected by generals who believed in the primacy of infantry. The airplane was mocked by admirals who could not conceive that ships might become vulnerable from above. In every case, it took a catastrophe or an individual willing to prove the establishment wrong through undeniable results before the institution would adapt. George succeeded where others failed because he did not ask for permission. He did not submit proposals through proper channels. He did not wait for a committee to approve his methods. He simply walked into the jungle with his toy rifle and started killing enemies that no one else could kill. By the time the institutional resistance could mobilize against him, he had already proven his case with bodies on the ground. The lesson applies far beyond military affairs. Every major innovation in business, science, and technology has faced similar resistance. The entrepreneurs who transformed industries, the scientists who revolutionized our understanding of the world, the engineers who built technologies that seemed impossible, all of them faced experts who explained why their ideas would never work. All of them succeeded by doing, rather than by arguing. And there is one final detail about this story that almost nobody knows. John George died in 2009 at the age of 90. He lived long enough to see the military come full circle. He watched as the Army and Marine Corps institutionalized sniper schools, adopting the very tactics he had improvised in the chaos of Guadalcanal. He saw the rifle evolve from a specialized tool for what his critics called nut jobs into an essential component of every infantry battalion. He witnessed the precision revolution that he had started transform modern warfare completely. Before he died, George made a decision about the Winchester Model 70, the rifle that had caused so much controversy, the weapon that had killed 17 enemy soldiers and trained the men who killed dozens more. The toy that had proven an entire military establishment wrong was not going to be buried with him or sold to a collector. He donated it to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. If you walk through that museum today, you might miss it. It sits in a glass case, surrounded by more famous weapons. Thompsons and Garands and grease guns that appeared in 1,000 war movies. The Winchester looks unassuming. It has a scratched stock and a simple scope. It looks like something you might find in your grandfather's closet, a deer rifle from a simpler time. But that rifle is not a deer rifle. It is the physical evidence of one man's refusal to accept the limits that others placed on him. It is the instrument that cleared a ridge when 1,000 men with proper weapons could not. It is the piece of wood and steel that proved that expertise and institutional authority mean nothing when they conflict with reality. The placard next to the rifle tells a brief version of the story. It mentions Guadalcanal and the sniper school and the number of kills. What it does not mention is the laughter. It does not mention the 6 weeks of mockery that George endured before he got his chance to prove himself. It does not mention the captain who called the rifle a joke, or the armorer who asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. Those men are not named in the museum. History has not recorded their skepticism. What history recorded instead was the result. 11 snipers dead in 4 days. 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly losses. A doctrine that saved thousands of lives across 3 wars and multiple continents. The critics are always forgotten. The results are what remain. We tell this story because history is too often written about generals and maps and grand strategy. It is easy to forget that wars are won by individuals. They are won by men like John George, who looked at an impossible problem, invisible enemies killing his friends, and decided to solve it himself with whatever tools he had available. He did not wait for better equipment. He did not wait for official approval. He did not wait for the establishment to catch up to reality. He took a civilian target rifle into a combat zone and proved that one man with the right skills and the right mindset can change everything. From a target shooter in Illinois, with a mail-order deer rifle to a lieutenant colonel whose methods transformed modern infantry warfare. John George demonstrated that innovation does not come from committees or approval processes. It comes from individuals willing to be called crazy until they prove everyone wrong. And because of what he did in those 16 days on Guadalcanal, because of the school he built, and the doctrine he inspired, thousands of American soldiers came home from wars that might otherwise have killed them. That is the measure of one man with one rifle and the courage to use it when everyone said it could not be done. If you know a story like this one, a forgotten innovator who changed history against all odds, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. The men and women who defied conventional wisdom to save lives and win wars deserve to be remembered. And if this is your first time watching this channel, consider subscribing. We dig through the archives every week, finding the obscure heroes and the forgotten innovations that shape the world we live in today. History remembers the generals who gave orders, but it was built by the sergeants and lieutenants and privates who ignored those orders when they knew better. John George knew better, and because he refused to leave his toy rifle in the tent, the world will never be the same.